Hello, everyone. We'll now begin with the formal welcome. My name is Dr. John Troyer, and I'm from the Center for Death and Society at the University of Bath. And it is my great pleasure to be here today with author and, I was going to say author and writer, but author, performer, comedian, screenwriter David Baddiel, who has a new book out called The God Desire, which we will be speaking about today, as well as a number of topics related to the Good Grief mini festival that is this weekend on the theme of hope and meaning, looking at different issues around grief and bereavement, I think is fair to say, and what that and how we can think about meaning that way for the festival itself. Like I said before at the top, we've got the chat is open if anyone wants to just say hello, what they're doing as people are doing. It looks like it's very popular to point out where people are from, as well as continue with conversations. The Q&A is also there, the Q&A box to drop in questions, which we'll get to. The plan for today is we'll do sort of a general 20-minute conversation, 20-minute conversation or so, David and myself, and then we'll go into a Q&A and then wrap up with everything around 1:15 or so, because there's another session and everyone has to go. So I just want to begin very well. Actually, we still got some more people coming in, but I think we should just get going. So
we need to get going.
Yeah.
And also they're just talking about cats.
I know.
I'm happy for the whole thing to be about cats. I'm all of them.
I know, but we could talk about, yes, it could quickly devolve into nothing but a cat conversation. So
actually, can I just say something about you asked a question, which is I had to sadly put down a cat called Monkey it's about 2 years ago. And I wrote about it. I was so incredibly upset at doing that. I cried possibly more than either of my parents' deaths. And that doesn't mean that the trauma of Monkey's death was, worse than them. But I think in the moment of you having to make the decision of causing the death of what feels like an innocent creature is actually incredibly deeply upsetting. It's a very sort of interesting corner of humanity's relationship to death, is that we have this thing, this role that we decide that, an animal, a pet, is going to die. And it's really, really deeply complicated in the moment.
Well, we could launch into the book that way. Actually, I think that's apropos of talking about the God Desire, which is you have a whole section toward the end about animals and about the human relationship with animals. And I hadn't thought about asking about this, but I think it's very relevant, which is this sort of human godlike power with non-human animals, which is a really clunky way of saying it. And one of the things I was wondering about, and this is a perennial question, but I think related to your topic about what is belief and how do people believe, I always wonder about what kind of imaginary, or is it possible that animals believe in any kind of God?
That's one of my central points. So that is not a bad way in, because The God Desire is a book I've written, an essay book, sort of 20,000 words or whatever, about being an atheist, but being a very particular type of atheist, which is most atheist books, I think, I haven't read them all, but the ones I have read are pretty macho at some level. They're very dismissive of religion, of God, and as a result, they kind of sit with this sort of idea that all religion is sort of silly and ridiculous, and superstition and all the rest of it. And what that denies in themselves, and I don't deny in this book, is the fact that religion serves a very specific purpose, I think. And that purpose is we live in a world where we know we're going to die. We know that life is probably meaningless, that it has no story or organizing principle, and that we're just here in what John Updike calls a sort of complex interval of light. And that's it. And God is a way of providing comfort and meaning to our lives, and pretending that we don't have the desire for that because we think God doesn't exist is actually kind of idiotic. And the book acknowledges all that in myself. It basically talks a lot about how much I deeply, deeply want God to exist. And for some people, that deep want means he does exist. For me, it's the opposite. For me, it's the opposite, that the intensity of my desire for God is sort of what tells me that he doesn't exist. It makes it clear to me in quite a depressive way that God is a projection of desire, that he is wish fulfillment. And one way that I know that to be true is that animals don't have God. And animals don't have God because they don't have death. I mean, they do have death, but they don't know about death, or they don't live with a consciousness of oncoming death, or I think they don't have a sense of meaninglessness or whatever. I mean, that's a projection, because I'm not absolutely certain about that, but I have a sense that the way that legends and stories and the creation throughout culture, throughout history, of godlike ideas by humans is not mimicked, as far as I can make out, in the animal kingdom. Again, thus proving to me that is the reason for God, rather than there being any objective supernatural reality to him.
Right. Well, and I think that one of the main points of the book is that it is, as you just said, the overarching desire for this thing that makes the conceit of God all the more complicated, because we want it so bad. Is it something you want so bad? Could you do that? And I agree. And I should say, I completely agree with you as someone who was raised in the Methodist Church in the States, but as a non-believer, by all definition, I would never. And I found many of those ideas compelling that way. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll have you do a short reading about some of you write about the Kaddish and the prayers that are done, but it was, before we started, we were talking about how you've had, both of your parents have died, your father, more recently, and then my entire family has died. My sister died in 2018 from brain cancer, and then my mom died in May, and my dad died in November. So my parents died about 6 months apart, all in the States. And I had one of these moments when I was reading your book, when I had actually really wished that I could give it. Well, actually, I would buy a copy to give to my dad, of course, but I would have my dad read it, because after my sister's death, my younger sister's death in 2018, he had a real crisis of faith. And he was a funeral director for over 35 years in the States, had done lots of lay ministerial work, knew lots of faith practices related to funerals. But that my sister's death caused him to have this real crisis of faith, and he actually began to embrace an atheism that I had not expected to see. And I was curious how you think the crisis of faith that is brought on by grief and bereavement and death, how that plays a role in any way, if at all, in that kind of desire for God.
Okay, so we talked about what I might read, and can I just say, this is the first sort of podcast where I've discussed this book, and thus I don't know where all the bits are in the book are relevant. No, but the reason I'm saying this is that there's a bit somewhere in this book which relates exactly to what you're talking about, which is that I actually don't agree. It's a major conversation in the God, no God thing, isn't it? Like, how can there be a God if terrible things happen, like your sister getting brain cancer, which I'm very sorry to hear about, but also, leprosy and war and stuff. How can there be a God? And I reject that, actually, as a atheist pawn to play in the chess game of God or no God, because as far as I'm concerned, God is beyond people who believe in God. God is beyond logic and reason, and God is beyond morality. And actually, if I was a believer, one thing I might say, and I think I say this in the book somewhere, is that God should be seen as an artist. God should not be seen as a just straightforward bringer of good. He's much more complicated than that. He's an artist, and he has created a story, as it were, of humanity for which we require evil. Without evil, good has no meaning. I mean, if you wanted to be straightforwardly Christian about it, Christ was crucified, which is obviously a terrible thing to happen. And he's crucified to save us for our sins. That's the story. And I talk a lot about story and how religion creates story in our lives. The story is required. It requires evil. It requires villainy in order to promote a greater good. Now, I don't know if a religious person would have the sort of cheek, to some extent, to tell you that your sister died for some sort of greater good. But overall, the issue of evil and awfulness in the world is not one that I think points to no God, because I think it's easy enough for believers to point to, there being something much more complicated about God than just a straightforward good and evil idea. So I don't really agree with that. But the book is. That's what the book is. It's sort of looking continually to plumb what is and isn't real about my own sense of there being no God. And it gets quite complicated in the middle of it, which I might read from now, where I start talking about how, obviously, my last book, Jews Don't Count, which is a kind of follow-up to, I don't know if it's a follow-up or whatever, but talked a lot about my Jewishness, my Jewish identity. And one of the things I make very clear in that book is that actually atheism is very important to that, because when people think incorrectly that anti-Semitism is religious intolerance, the thing I always say is, well, I'm an atheist, but the Gestapo would shoot me tomorrow. And neo-Nazis don't ask if I keep kosher before they burn down my house. So this book goes a bit further into that. What does it mean to be a Jewish atheist? I'm going to tell a funny story, actually, which is I think quite a lot of Jews are sort of secretly atheists. And I do sometimes use it myself to get out of things I'm asked to do by the Jewish community. A rabbi, my local rabbi, I didn't even know I had a local rabbi because I don't go to synagogue, but called me up at Hanukkah and said, would you come and light the menorah, the big candelabra outside the synagogue for people? And I said, you know, I'm really sorry, this is my trump card. I said, I'm sorry to tell you this, Rabbi, but I'm an atheist. He said, so am I. And I thought, really, it turns out there are more Jewish atheists than I would have thought. And I try and explain this, and I get into this thing of like showing how much it means to me, all this, even though I don't believe. And I do it via grief. I don't believe in God. That is perhaps clear by now, but it is simplistic to imagine that because I don't believe in God, my Jewish identity can be easily excised from Judaism. I have done jokes that suggest it can, such as this one. People say to me, how can you be an atheist Jew? I say, I don't believe in God, I believe in Larry David, which means to me that Jewishness is about culture, and that includes comedy. But there's an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm in which Larry visits some Orthodox Jews to get Richard Lewis moved up the waiting list for a kidney transplant. It's maybe best if you just go and watch it. And while staying in a skiing chalet with them, he eats some treif, unkosher food, and to restore that plate to spiritual cleanliness is told he has to bury it in the garden for 3 days, which is so niche Jewish, even I'd never heard of it. But the point is, the religion hangs around. Being a cultural Jew still involves knowledge of, interacting with, being ironic about, or having a comic take on the religion. And sometimes the irony falls away. A friend of mine, a man of science, an atheist, whose son died tragically young, sang Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, at the funeral. This is what it means in English. Magnified and sanctified be your name, O God, throughout the world which you have created according to your will. May your sovereignty be accepted in our own days and our lives and in the life of the house of Israel. May your great name be blessed forever and ever. Amen. The usual stuff of prayer, the endless OCD-like repetition of praise, the desperate hope that if you say something enough times, a fragment might get through the ether. I do not find it moving. But the Hebrew, or rather the Hebrew, and here I've actually printed the Hebrew script, I don't know if you can see it, because the sound in my mind carries the association of the script, of the ancient hieroglyphic, which because I had to learn it at my Jewish primary school, I can read. Yit gadal v'yit gadash shemei rabbah ba'alma devrei v'vrutei v'yamlich malchutei b'cheyachon u'v'yehei machon u'v'yehei dachol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'vat saman kariv v'imru amen. You don't have to know what it means. At the burial of a son, those words, just the sound, the ancient music, the sonic pain of them, connects you, the atheist Jew praying and the atheist Jew listening, with centuries of tradition and suffering and defiance. I know I would do the same in my friend's terrible place. So the point about that is that I think that one of the reasons I've written a book about atheism that is not a straightforward book about not believing in God and God being silly and God being just a sort of fairy tale is that if you're a member of a minority associated with religion, you know that your identity is connected to religion, even if you don't believe in it anymore. And so therefore you can't dismiss it because you feel all sorts of connections, spiritual, emotional, whatever, with the words of that religion. And that doesn't mean that you have any belief. I would say I have 100% non-belief in a supernatural entity, and yet I am still moved by those prayers.
Sure, and I think that is there's so there was some work. I'm gonna bring in another text, another book, the relationship I think to this. It made me think of when I was reading the book, your book, The God Desire, which is in 1981, their Rabbi Harold Kushner publishes When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and he was a conservative rabbi in the States, and it was sort of reflecting on in the 70s, but into the 80s, the question of where was God, and particularly growing out of World War II and sort of in the camp system, like where was God? And as we turn our very relevant question. And he came up with this really interesting thing. And the reason I'm talking about this too is this was something my dad taught for many years for parents who were grieving, particularly parents who'd murdered children, but also parents who had lost children and different things with family members. Like, where was God in all of this? And what Kushner comes up with is, he said, God's power is not infinite. God's power is finite. I'm paraphrasing here. And that God's power must be finite because he can't prevent people from dying, as it were, that way. And the reason I was thinking about this was because from a very young age, when I would first read about this, it became clear to me that within Judaism, it seemed to me there was a lot more struggling about what is the power of God in all these situations, if we humans can even assume that. That I think growing up in the Methodist Church was not something we were necessarily talking about. And I found that particularly telling in how you structure this, which was, I can find great meaning in these rituals and these practices, even if I don't necessarily believe in the idea that's motivating them.
Yeah.
And that is, to me, the most important thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's actually participating in this, regardless of the belief system that's part of it.
Yeah.
Because these are, finite things. We have finite lives that way.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that much about the notion that of God, not if you do believe in God through, as a Jewish God, through having that his power is not infinite, because my sense is that certainly in the Old Testament it feels pretty infinite. But I must just tell a joke, because it so relates to what you're saying, and I've talked about this joke before in slightly different contexts, which is people saying, oh, you can't do material about this, that, and the other, you can't do material about the Holocaust. That's not true. It just depends on the specific joke. Rather, it's not the subject matter, it's the specifics of the joke. So there's this joke that a Jewish academic once told me, which is such a beautiful joke, I think, which is about a Holocaust survivor who dies after the war of natural causes and goes to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, God asks the survivor to tell him a Holocaust joke. So the survivor does. And God says, that's not funny. And the survivor says, well, I guess you had to be there. Right. And what I love about that is it's what you've just said, which is, where was God in 1939 to 45? Where was God? And in terms of what we were talking about before, a very devoted believer could just argue, well, I'm afraid the Holocaust, along with everything else terrible that happens in the world, is not the responsibility of God, or at least God's plan is that evil is part of the world, terrible things are part of the world, and whatever. So, but it does become very, very difficult to imagine that any kind of, system that you might place faith into would include the Holocaust, I think. Whether you can then say, well, what it proves is that God's existence is finite. That's an interesting idea that I'd never really thought about.
Well, that was Kushner's interjection into this. We don't have to get into that whole, it's interesting to think about. And actually, it's made me want to go back and reread his work. In terms of what you're saying here, because like I was saying before, and I think this is true of many people who've had someone close to them die. And again, going back to what I'd said about my dad's crisis of faith after my sister had died, I think it wasn't so much. I mean, he in part said, "Where was God?" And two, then he was like, there is no God. Like, although you've talked about that's different than how you want to structure the book itself. I was
talking to someone last night who, a really close friend of mine, Hugh Dennis, who was in a show I used to do called The Mirror Experience. And his dad was the Bishop of Ipswich, and was a churchman his whole life, and he said, like a week before he died, having been utterly convinced, he thought his dad was, about God and about the afterlife, he said to him, I've always believed in God, I've always believed in an afterlife, and you know what, I might be right. And this is a week before he died. And this was part of the conversation that we were having about doubt. About I am of the belief that even very, very fervent believers, even if they don't express it, doubt, because it's so clear that the chances are that we're going back to oblivion rather than to any kind of cogent afterlife or whatever. There's something I wanted to mention, actually, in terms of you talking about your dad. I mean, my dad died in last year, and my mum died a few years before that. And some people may know this. I mean, I talked a lot about my dad's dementia, which is a type of slow death. And I've talked, after my mother died, I did a show in the West End, which was about both of them. It was about my father's dementia, but also my mother, who during her life had a massive affair with a golfing memorabilia salesman and turned our lives over to golf as a result. And the reason I did that, apart from the fact that it was funny, is that at her funeral, I noticed all these people coming up to me and saying, oh, your mother was wonderful. She was a wonderful woman. She's wonderful. And what I thought was, that really doesn't say anything about her at all, does it? That really doesn't bring my mother back to life. My mother died very suddenly. It was really kind of shocking and traumatic how she died. And what I wanted, I think, at that point emotionally was sort of some persistence, some actual kind of persistence of her in my life. And the way to do that, I discovered, was to be very, very specific about who she was. And that involves, of course, and it will involve for anyone, being a flawed person and a crazy person and an idiosyncratic person, not a wonderful person. I think what I said in the show is the dead, despite what we might like to think, are not angels. And if you consider them angels, it's kind of a second erasure of them, right? Because your memory of them cannot sustain them just being wonderful people, because no human is a straightforward, wonderful person. And so when I did the show, my brother, who was actually very worried about me doing the show, the first night I said in a Q&A afterwards, I said, sorry, I'm not going to take any questions until I hear what my brother thinks. And he said, I loved it because it felt like she was in the room. Right. And I felt, well, then I have achieved what I set out to achieve, which is to sort of bring this woman back to life. But to do that, I have to tell the truth.
Right. And be honest about the dead, which I think is that when we talk about grieving, and I think that there is, grieving, I thought about this in the context of your book too, about like, so if you're concerned about grieving before God or what God is playing and how you talk about this person, that it is, I think if we're honest about both our emotions and feelings after someone dies, that means being very open and honest about the complications and complications of the individual who's died. And that is, I think the move to try and not be that way, I think is dishonest and can cause even more problems for people potentially if they go on. And that there's been a whole there's been a whole genre of writing about being more honest in obituaries, for example,
right,
about what a person was like. And
I think also
a different book too,
I think with obituaries, maybe I actually think that it's sort of like being able to joke about one's own ethnic background if you're from that ethnic background. What I felt with that show is, who's going to tell me that I can't make these jokes or tell these stories about my mother? And for me, that's part, I have the license to do that because I am my mother's son, but also, my project is to remember her in a truthful way. If you come back to the God Desire, if you ask me what my motivating principle was in writing this book and doing that show, it's truth. I'm obsessed with only one thing in my life, and that is truth. And obviously we all have different ways of getting at truth. And at the present time, and this is partly what the book says, is truth is becoming more and more relative. Like the idea of objective truth is more and more suspect. And the internet has done that. And I am interested in whether there are objective truths and whether how you can express those. And one of those was, this is actually what my mother was like. She wasn't a wonderful person, which is not true. That doesn't mean I didn't love her. But wonderful is not what she was in any kind of obvious way. And similarly, I personally think it is an objective truth that God doesn't exist. Now, from that position, I'm happy to say I deeply want him to exist. I deeply understand why people need him to exist, but I believe it to be an objective truth that that creature does not exist.
Right. And I think that it was throughout the book, by the time you get to the coda, which I'm always fans of codas in book, and I do like how you lace that in there in the very beginning. Like you could skip that forward to the coda if you want to, but in the coda you talk about immortality a bit, and I wanted to come back to this because the topic of immortality is always striking to me in relationship to God. But you also mentioned two figures, and we don't have to talk about the first, which is, you mentioned the death of the Queen as a relationship to,
well, that's what the coda is about. The coda was written just after the death of the Queen.
About someone we thought would live forever, but
I got this sense from the Queen and her death that she represented a type of immortality, because people were sort of talking about her like she'd virtually lived forever. And the way that the monarchy works with this instant transformation of, like, as soon as she dies, King Charles is king, that has a sort of immortality, a transference to it. And I think which you're heading towards is, I related it to Doctor Who.
Right. Yeah. No, it was, because there was this, I'll do it very quickly. But when Peter Capaldi was Doctor Who, there was a great line where he had said, immortality it's not living forever. That's not what it's like. It's immortality is everybody else dying. And I was thinking about this because I thought, in a sense, if there is an immortal God, then what that means is this immortal God just watches everyone die. and that is how do we make sense of that? There's nothing you can do about it, that death actually becomes, in a way, this is weird language to use, but a kind of salvation from having that immortal like, you know, if you will, sort of that immortal grief of everybody just dying.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about in the idea of immortality, which obviously is something that humans do desire, I don't think they think it through. I think it through. I don't think it through when I think, oh, you know, here I am at 58. I don't want to particularly be dead soon. And that's what I think would lead me to believe in God. But yes, if I was to push that further, I would think like, well, what will immortality look like? It will just be constant grief. Unless everyone else is immortal, I suppose, which of course is what I do begin the book by saying that when I was 6 or 7 and I first understood what death was, and I'm an insomniac because my mum said it's like a long sleep from which you never wake up. But that I remember praying to Hashem, the Hebrew God. It wasn't just for me to survive after death. It was for my mum and dad and for my best friend at school, for my cat. And that actually relates to something. There's John Updike is my favorite writer. He wrote a lot about God and Christianity. He was a believer. And he talks about how it's not actually selfish to want to live on after death, because what you're upset about, what you're anxious about, is missing out on the party, the social life, as in terms of, you know, being with other people. And I think that is true. I think, you know, at some level, what we're frightened of is not just oblivion, but loneliness, some sort of concept of loneliness.
Right. And you talk about that, the idea of annihilation, oblivion, annihilation, and what that within the book. And I agree with that. I do want to point out, we do have the Q&A. We can move into questions by all means.
Yeah,
please.
sure.
If you want to drop questions in the Q&A here, I think I'm going to shift over into the Q&A. So if anyone, please drop questions in here. I'm going to summarize this one, which is, this is from Sheila. Hope Sheila, I've done that all right. But my mom, age 95, so nearest to the end, has no real faith, but has asked me a lot, what is the point of living a morally good life if there is no hell to punish you or for heaven's reward to you that way? Actually, that's an interesting question, because that comes up and she asks any thoughts about this. You talk a bit about the relationship of heaven and hell, but how do you see that in terms of living a moral or a moral life, as it were? Which Spinoza is interesting here too. Actually, you mentioned Spinoza.
Well, so later in the book, I sort of try and deal with a few of the sort of, you know, canards of this conversation that come up, and one of them is like, well, if there's no God and no heaven or hell, why should we, you know, have an organized society where we care about people and et cetera, et cetera? And what I say is that I in this book am not interested in the sort of social implications of atheism, and lots of atheists are. Spinoza is one of them. Santayana is. They you know, they spend a lot of time saying, oh, how is society going to work without God? And what I think is, I don't know. But the truth is what I'm interested in, and the truth is that there is no God. And I think, you know, I use the example of, if you throw a stone in a pond, the ripples can be beautiful, or they can lead to a boat being upturned and people dying. It makes no difference to the fact of the stone being thrown, right? So the truth, in my opinion, has no responsibility for the consequences of the truth. If what you're interested in is the truth, I'm not saying it's not an interesting conversation. It's not the one I'm having. And as it happens, if there are some religious strictures that lead to us leading a good life, like, for example, the 10 Commandments saying thou shalt not kill, I'm totally happy to accept that that's where it comes from, even whilst knowing that God didn't actually write them in stone on a tablet for Moses. But I'm still happy to accept that that is a good way of living your life. So, so in terms of what that question is asking, I think we have to just try and live a good life, and the provenance of how we might live a good life is we pick them up from different places. But the truth is what I'm interested in. I mean, someone said to me yesterday that Louis V. Mayer, when he died, having achieved a lot in Hollywood, wherever he did, his last words were "nothing matters." Now that's deeply, you know, bleak. It's probably true, right? It's probably true. It depends what you mean by what matters, right? I mean, I think stuff matters in the moment, and it matters that you are a good person and you're kind to your loved ones and kind to animals and whatever. But if what you think matters is a sort of legacy of the eternal future, then no, it doesn't. and we have to accept that, I think.
Right. Well, exactly. As we make meaning and have hope and things like that. No,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a question here from Sam. Sam, this is a great question. David, you do talk about this in the beginning of the book. I think this is fair. Why is a God, if we think it does or doesn't exist, a quote unquote he, in scare quotes?
Well,
You do talk about that in the book and how you
yes,
position.
I think I say slightly as a joke that
Yeah.
a modern God would have they them pronouns, I suspect. I'm using he just because I am talking about a figment of the imagination that is traditionally referred to in the masculine, or not always, and certainly not. I do also talk about a much more kind of, if you like, modern conception of God as a kind of cosmic vibration, or whatever, you know, people like Russell Brand imagine this kind of sense of the divine, and obviously that would be ungendered or whatever. But just for shorthand, it's easier to refer to God as he, and I capitalize it in the book. I, you know, would say, of course, that is one of the ways in which we project our imaginations, because I talk in the book about how God is also a parent figure. You know, in terms of the desire, what do we want? We want a sort of superhero dad who chases off death. And I would say the default, certainly up to this point in time, tends to be male with that. God is sort of someone fighting off death, fighting off these bad things. And so we default to the idea of that being masculine, which of course is sexist.
Right. Being an American of a certain generation, I automatically default to George Burns as God from the Oh God films, which I don't know if they ever made it across.
You know, George Burns is God, right? In those films. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of a Bruce Almighty thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. We could, and well, then there's the whole genre of like how many times Morgan Freeman has played God as well.
Yeah.
That's counted as well. Like,
I think most people do imagine Morgan as God.
Yeah,
you know,
both the president of the United States and God at different times in his career.
Yeah.
We have a great question here from Wendy, which is, despite my atheism, I share Herbert Howell's opinion that and this is a quote, I don't think there is anything after death, end quote. I'd still like to be pleasantly surprised. So would you, David, like to be pleasantly surprised if there was something after death? If that was
I think I would. I was thinking about this. Okay, I'll try to tell this quite quickly. I tell a ghost story, like a real ghost story that happened to me. Okay, this is despite me being 100% rationalist and blah blah blah, because the book is about how I want these things to exist. So I used to do a football comedy show called Fantasy Football, and a player called Jeff Astle, old player, used to play for West Brom, used to sing at the end of that show. And one time we're all standing around, and Jeff by this time was quite old, and in fact later on, sadly, he got dementia. So he used to say some quite weird things sometimes. And someone said to him, "Did you ever go see the old West Brom players anymore, Jeff?" Jeff said, "I went up the other day to see them all. I saw Neil Franklin, that was an old player, and then he said, and I saw his widow." Right? Which is an odd thing to say. And his wife, who was there, said, "What do you mean you saw his widow? You just said you saw him." And Jeff looked a bit confused and just said, "Oh, I don't know. I saw him." And he sort of said widow again, and then just sort of went quiet. Anyway, I used to share a flat with Frank Skinner at the time, and we went home, and Frank used to get up in the morning and check what was then the CFAX, because we didn't have the internet then. The CFAX is a TV site for West Bromwich Albion, and Neil Franklin had died that night. He had died that night. And obviously I love telling that story because it feels like, oh my God, ghosts exist. It's true. Now, since then, I've thought, well, actually, Jeff was starting to lose his memory. Maybe he had actually heard that Neil Franklin was already dead, but had confused that in his mind with seeing him another time. And that's the rational explanation. But that's not the explanation I want. The explanation I want is that ghosts exist, even though it's interesting, ghosts are frightening. But obviously, if ghosts exist, the afterlife exists. And that's that's sort of a win, because I'm frightened of death, right? So I would be pleasantly surprised, and I would hope it. But of course, that's then a host of other problems involved, like, would I be in hell? I've spent a lot of my life saying, you don't exist, God. He'll be pissed off. He'll send me to hell, etc., etc.
Right. Or some kind of, elaborate purgatory.
Yeah.
Which is suck. You're sort of stuck. I had you mentioned, I had the strangest dream the other night. I don't know why I'm talking about this. So all of a sudden, I was in this enormous sort of like white room, and it was sort of like a weird waiting room, or kind of a green room almost. And I was talking with Prince, of all people, and like with like purple smoke and purple sparkles coming. I completely have no idea where this was.
Sounds brilliant.
and he said, we have a mutual friend, and I used to babysit for her. I was like, what? How is this all?
Wow.
And it was my good friend and author, Haley Campbell's written a book about death and dying. So let Haley know that. And I was like, so I have no idea why Prince was talking to me in a dream about being your babysitter, but nonetheless, I wanted to let you know, because I feel like Prince is communicating with me now from the dead,
well, that's
from some kind of waiting room or something.
Wonderful
like
if Prince is doing that. I mean, actually, someone I know also said to me the other day, there's a book called Proof of Heaven. Have you ever heard of this book?
Yeah.
I can't actually remember the name of the guy who wrote it, but her point was he's not just a sort of religious guy, he's a neurosurgeon. He's called Dr. Eben something or other. And he got, I think, viral meningitis and was in a coma for a while, and then came out of it and said, you know, he was in the White Room and he saw the light, and it was all that. And her point was, you know, because he's a scientist, this must be true. Unfortunately, I read it, and it's clearly he was in a coma. That's not death. And when you're in a coma, there's evidence that his brain waves are still going on. Right. And so therefore it's a bit similar, I would have thought, to your Prince dream, was what he the obvious to me. But again, people want to believe, right? So that book's a bestseller. That book's a massive bestseller.
Yeah, well, and well, exactly, absolutely. Like the power of belief is quite a thing. We have an anonymous with actually 2 questions here, but we'll go with the second one first. Is it arrogant to be an atheist? That's a question. There's so many things that have yet to be discovered.
My cat really wants to go out now. So,
okay.
Show you her. This is Pip, everyone. And she really wants to go out. So do excuse me just for a second. Okay. Is it arrogant? Well, I try and deal with that a bit. In the book, saying that yes, I think that certainly the way that it's been expressed by people like Richard Dawkins in the past, which, as I said, is very dismissive of religion and very dismissive of identity. And at one point, I say, you know, dismissing religion as fairy tales is intellectually like not great, because fairy tales say a lot about what it means to be human. You know? and this is the point, is that I think all of these stories and all of these legends tell us what it means to be human, and so you shouldn't dismiss them. However, I think some believers will still find an arrogance in the book, because it does come from a position of absolute certainty that God doesn't exist. But so far, a lot of Christians at least have quite liked it. Giles Fraser, who was he Dean of St. Paul's? Anyway, he's a Christian writer. And he's said a very nice thing on Twitter, where he said this is the only atheist book that he's ever read that really gets religion. So I don't know. I mean, actually, Frank Skinner, who is in the book quite a lot, because I talk a lot about Frank Skinner, who's a devout Catholic, and his very deep intensity of belief, and his belief that he will burn in hellfire for things that he feels he's done wrong. I've given him the book, but at the moment he's saying he doesn't want to read it because he's worried it might, you know, shatter his belief. So I don't know. My interest is not, I think I talk about this in the book, being a spoil sport. Like, I don't want to, I think I use the example of like, I'm not an atheist, like someone who would go to a cosplay convention in San Diego of people pretending to be Spider-Man and saying, what are you doing? This is silly. All these, it's not real, because it is real. Right. It is real. It's a story, and it is real, and that creation is really important. People invest in it emotionally. But I am very interested in the truth, so I try and find ways of creating that truth without necessarily dismissing what people believe.
The one thing I was trying to impart to my students when because I teach a sociology of death class, and you know, again, I've said I'm a non-believer, but raised, so I guess in some ways culturally Methodist. I don't know if that's even possible. Not really even that, but you know what I'm saying. But what I try to convey to my students is I think it's too easy to just sort of in a kind of what I would describe as Dawkins way, just be like, you know, just religion is just pointless, just give up on it. I don't think because there are a lot of people who do have a lot of faith and a lot of belief, and that is one of those things to, I think, to at least think about and take on board, because particularly when it comes to grief and bereavement and death and dying, and people think about these things, you just sort of like chuck it out the window. I think it's careless. It's too easy a move. Like there should
that's the point. I think there's an awful lot to be said about religion and about what it is and what it does for people, and huge histories of it. And so therefore dismissing it, which this might be unfair, by the way, but I get the sense that is what Richard Dawkins does, and maybe some other atheists, I'm too interested in it. I'm too interested in it as a subject. I also note, as I said, I think I've said this already, but like, I often find that my own sense of God and religion is reflected back to me by what you might call the most intellectual believers. So John Updike has written a lot about God,
Right.
and he says all the things that I think. He talks a lot about death and comfort, and the sense that God as a parent, and all those lead him to the idea that God must exist. And it leads me the opposite way. It leads me to the sense that this is desire. What we're talking about is very deep subconscious desires. But I'm on the same plane as him in every other respect.
Right. What leads you to God? How do you get there? Which is the classic question going all the way back to, I don't like, Rene Descartes. Like, he's like, how does Descartes get there? I'm taking that a totally different direction. A friend of mine and I joked one time that Richard Dawkins should release an album called Richard Dawkins Sings the Gospel Classics.
Right. I'd very much like to hear that.
Yeah, I would too. We got a couple quick questions here, and then we're going to wrap up, everyone. I'm really sorry because we got to get going. But we got a couple questions here, but I'm going to go with this last question because I think it's a good one. We started the whole thing with from Gina, which is, any plans for more cat books from you?
Well, I haven't written a cat book. I wrote a big article which you can find on the Observer if you put my name in and cats, about cats. I wrote about having 4 cats, and it's very much a sort of quite emotional, also funny thing about how I think cats, having written about Jews and how they're a maligned group, I should move on to cats because I think cats are quite maligned. I think people think of cats as sort of arrogant and narcissistic and not really connecting to humans like dogs do. I really don't believe any of that. Like, I've had cats all my life, and they're all unbelievably different personalities, and often very, very kind of caring and kind creatures, I think, and intelligent and all the rest of it. So I'm very pro cats. In fact, I probably, if I had to choose a religion, it would be the Egyptian one that worshipped cats.
Right.
That's what I'd go for.
Yeah. The interestingly enough, a friend looked at this. There are more people who've gotten, after a pet dies, a tattoo for a dog as opposed to a tattoo for a cat.
Oh, that's interesting.
So there's more dog tattoos than cat.
Well, I think people who have dogs feel that the dogs connect to them.
Right.
I've never had a dog, so that's not fair. I can't comment on that, but I can tell you that I've connected with almost every cat I've ever had, including the ones that seem to hate me.
Right, as far as that goes. Well, yeah. and I think that's one way of I think of thinking about, so as kind of a final point, I think that's one way of thinking about grief and bereavement, and what both the Good Grief Festival is about, but also the book, which is how do we make sense of these losses, and in both a kind of like very, it's sad, it's terrible, it sucks. Like, anyone who tries to talk about, I mean, the idea of like, I'm always struck by the number of people who try to tell me, looking for some kind of closure or something like that. And I mean, I get it, but I'm like, I'm never looking for a kind of closure, because I'm always thinking about it, talking about it. And I think that's okay. You know what I mean?
I think that's right.
You know what I mean? That it's important. But it's important to carry these things with us. I don't think there's anything unhealthy.
I think that's so interesting. I mean, that's like a whole other conversation, but the notion of closure is one that I think is sometimes a bit pernicious. So it's not in this book, but it's in another book that I've written, which is about a sort of version of the show that I was talking about my parents. And I talk about how Hollywood really has created this idea of death as a sort of white room where your loved one says something wise and, forgiving, and you can let them go and whatever. And my mum didn't die at all like that. She died in Northwick Park Hospital with lots of people shouting and like clear, and like, people, junior doctors, exhausted and not able to deal with it. And it was awful. It was horrible. All right. And a lot of people don't get that. They don't get the beautiful moment of death or whatever. And I think the expectation of it, as often with Hollywood expectations, actually can be quite undermining of people's lives. So I think you're right. I think what you have to do is not expect closure, but carry on talking about it.
Yeah.
And if you carry on talking about it, you'll find a way of living with it, but don't expect it's all going to be fine, because it might not be.
No, I completely agree. And if there's anything I would hope anyone would take away from your book, partly as a sort of, to use the fancy term, exegesis on faith and belief, but would be about God, but also how that relates to how you think about your own self and person in relationship to what is life after you have the loss of parents, right? The loss of anyone. And I read that in the book. Perhaps I'm fairly projecting myself in this, but nonetheless, I saw that in the book.
That's in there.
And I think that's fair. All right, everyone, I'm so sorry. We have to go. I'm sure it's been my great pleasure to talk with David Baddiel.
Can I just say, there's been like, I can't see them all because if I clicked on them, I would lose. But every time I look down, the chat looks amazing. Rachel, chats got me through ...
Yeah, I know it was. This
sounds
has actually
great.
been one of the more productive chats I've seen in a webinar. So that's been great. So thank you everyone for attending. My name is John Troyer. I'm part of the Center for Deafness Society. Let me give that a plug. But we're here, of course, to talk about David Baddiel's book, as we did, The God Desire, on sale in all the places you can get the book, and we've got a link to it for pre-sale for sale as well through the Good Grief Festival. So please join me in thanking David for a fantastic session this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of the festival. And everyone, take good care, and let us all thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Being here.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.